Hello, friends. Welcome to Philosophy for Everyday Life. This is Jimmy. Let's see. Welcome. Just getting things arranged here. So this is Kant for everyone. This is the 9th episode, and we are finally getting started on the introduction to the critique of pure reason. The previous 8 episodes were sort of background. We looked at some commentators and also spent a lot of time on the prefaces. There are 2 prefaces, one for each of the 2 editions of the critique of pure reason. So I wanted to provide some general background and review on what we've done so far. There are a few things that I've few kind of general ideas I've used to frame what Kant is up to, why this matters. One is that learning to read philosophy or to understand a particular philosopher is a lot like learning a language. And that means partly just sort of jumping in. There are certain things that just won't make sense until you have spent a while kind of immersed in the language of that philosopher. And of course, each philosopher is engaging with others, generally speaking, which means that it's also helpful to know what others have said and how that specific philosopher is reacting to or against or with the writings of others. So we've looked at Plato and Aristotle in a previous episode in that spirit, with the idea of trying to flesh out the meaning of the philosophical discourse that Kant is creating for us. A couple of other things I'll mention, just by way of review. I said this near the beginning of probably the first or second live stream, but understanding modern philosophy in general is helped by understanding Kant. Everything is downstream from Kant in a way since his writings. That's both European continental philosophy in folks like Hegel, and then forward to Heidegger and critical theory, as well as in Anglo-American analytic philosophy. People like Kripke or Quine are also very engaged with ideas that come directly from Kant. So understanding Kant helps whatever else you might be interested in is incredibly useful. Let me see what else. Kant's big concern in the critique of pure reason is to turn metaphysics into a science. And he uses the idea of kind of a random groping or casting about to describe what he thinks metaphysics has been like until his writings, until he sort of solved the basic problems of metaphysics on a permanent level. And so he thinks of himself as analogous to someone like Isaac Newton in physics, or Copernicus in astronomy, or Euclid in geometry. He is establishing a permanent, rigorous foundation for metaphysics that it can operate from forever after, from this point forward. And the way that he thinks he's done this is through what he calls a Copernican revolution. And perhaps I will draw this out. Copernicus shifted how we think about the cosmos by moving from this picture of the Earth. Let's see, I need better. The Earth being at the center, and the sun rotating around the Earth, to the sun being at the center. and the earth rotating. And Kant thinks he's done something similar with our knowledge or our cognition of objects. And before I complained about the use of the word cognition, but I think it's helpful to think of, we have before Kant said objects. We thought of objects being at the center and our knowledge, I'll just abbreviate knowledge or cognition, rotating around objects. And Kant says his Copernican revolution was to put knowledge or cognition at the center and say that objects must conform to our knowledge or cognition. So that's Kant's Copernican revolution. And this is the fundamental idea that he thinks allowed him to set metaphysics on this sure path of being a science. Science not in the sense of the natural sciences, but as a rigorous, disciplined body of knowledge that can be built upon and expanded. Another important idea from Kant is that reason finds itself in a kind of dilemma. And this is why metaphysics has had such a hard time up to this point. Kant thinks that reason cannot help asking questions that it is incapable of answering. And these are metaphysical questions about things like God, immortality, and freedom, free will. Kant thinks that speculative or theoretical reason, which is the type of reason that answers theoretical questions, finds itself compelled to ask about these things, but doesn't have the resources to answer these questions because they extend beyond experience. And he thinks reason gets itself into trouble when it attempts to go out beyond the bounds of experience. Peter Strawson's famous book is called The Bounds of Sense. And this is really what Kant is trying to say. Theoretical reason cannot do that. But he thinks practical reason has the ability to go out further than theoretical reason can. And he calls this ability of practical reason to venture into metaphysical territory that speculative reason cannot. Kant calls this faith. Let me see if there is anything else I wanted to touch on. I think that's good. That gets us started. We're going to look at the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, and I'm going to switch over to the Geyer and Wood translation for today, just to switch it up a little bit and just to give them give credit where credit is due. I've been using the Kemp-Smith translation up to this point. The Geyer and Wood translation is also very important. So here we are. This is the introduction. I think I'll read a few pages here and then look at some texts from David Hume, because I think they provide some really helpful context for what Kant is up to. So, introduction. 1. The idea of transcendental philosophy. Experience is, without doubt, the first product that our understanding brings forth as it works on the raw material of sensible sensations. And I'll also mention there are we have these letters here in the side, the A, and down here. That signifies first edition. And if we come down, we'll start to see B. That signifies second edition. And I'm wanting to make sure that we get to the correct part of the second edition there. I'm just going to read the introduction to the second edition. I'm going to start here because I think it's clearer. Okay, on the difference between pure and empirical cognition. There is no doubt whatever that all our cognition begins with experience. For how else should the cognitive faculty be awakened into exercise if not through objects that stimulate our senses and in part themselves produce representations, in part bring the activity of our understanding into motion to compare these to connect or separate them, and thus to work up the raw material of sensible impressions into a cognition of objects that is called experience. So this is already quite important. I'm going to misspell it probably. Kant. That's pretty close. We get two translations of this word. And Kemp Smith, who did the sort of first important, not the first, but the other really important English translation, Norman Kemp Smith, of the Critique of Pure Reason, he translates it using the word knowledge. And there's something helpful about this, because knowledge is just a key philosophical term. We can going all the way back to Plato. Of course, epistemology is the study of knowledge, or of how we know what we know. Paul Guyer and Alan Wood's translation, which we're looking at right now, they use the word cognition. And I have complained about their use of that word to translate erkenntnis. But there is something helpful here, where they're saying cognition begins with experience. We don't start thinking until we have some experience to think about. Prior to experience, there is no cognition. It's also helpful to think about the word knowledge in this context. And if we just replace that here, there is no doubt whatever that all of our knowledge begins with experience. I think it's important to say both of these things. Both that prior to experience, we have no cognition, we're not cognizing, we're not cognizant of anything. And also that prior to experience, we have no knowledge. This is also critically important for Kant to say that beyond the circle of experience, there is no knowledge, strictly speaking. So Kant says there is no doubt whatever that all our cognition, all of our knowledge begins with experience. And I love to think about the opening lines of important philosophical works. Aristotle's Metaphysics, all men by nature desire to know. He's also focused on this idea of knowledge. So why is this so certain in Kant's mind? Because he says, how else should the cognitive or the knowing faculty be awakened into exercise, if not through objects? And object is a technical term for Kant. It's anything that we have knowledge of. And that's a bit circular. So these are some terms that will have to be fleshed out as we go. If not through objects that stimulate our senses. So this is important about objects. Objects are things that stimulate our senses, which is a passive experience. Erkenntnis, if we were to draw sort of a line like this is active. Versus on this side, we have passive faculties, which are sensation or intuition. These are things that just come at us. So objects are things that stimulate our senses. We experience them passively. And they produce representations in us, in part, because we also contribute to the production of representations. In part, bring the activity of our understanding into motion to compare these understanding. This is an active faculty. Verstehen. Compare these, connect or separate them, and thus work up the raw material of sensible impressions into a cognition, or into knowledge of objects that is called experience. So experience is the knowledge of objects. It includes an active component, which is our understanding working on something, and a passive component, which is sensation or intuition, things that are coming in from the outside in some fashion. Everything he's said here so far sounds quite empiricist. It sounds like something you could read in John Locke or David Hume, that we receive these sense impressions and then our mind works on them, combines them in different ways to sort of make something of them. But, this is a critical but, although all our cognition commences, it begins with experience. All of our knowledge begins with experience. Yet, it does not on that account all arise from experience. So there's something that happens. Experience prompts it. Experience is the occasion for it. But there's something happening in experience that is not actually the result of experience. For it could well be that even our experiential cognition or knowledge is a composite of that which we receive through impressions and that which our own cognitive faculty, merely prompted by sensible impressions, provides out of itself. So it's a composite of two things: that which we receive through impressions, the passive, and that which our own cognitive faculty provides out of itself, the active. Which addition we cannot distinguish from that fundamental material until long practice has made us attentive to it and skilled in separating it out. He talks about this in the preface to the second edition, using the analogy of a chemist, sort of, I'm forgetting the word, but there's a, like maybe reduction, separating out two different elements that are in a composite. And he thinks that's part of what his critique of reason is doing. The idea is, because all of our knowledge, all of our cognition begins with experience, it's very easy and natural to arrive at the conclusion that it all comes out of experience. But Kant's saying, no, there is an element of knowledge or cognition that we supply. It's active, and it's prior to experience, not in time, but in origin. But it requires skill and time to separate out these two. It is therefore at least a question requiring, oh my gosh, I have not had the text up. I'm sorry. Okay. So this is where we are. But although all our cognition commences with experience, yet it does not on that account all arise from experience. So these are the two elements: that which we receive through impressions, and that which our own cognitive faculty provides out of itself. It is therefore at least a question requiring closer investigation, and one not to be dismissed at first glance, whether there is any such cognition independent of all experience, and even of all impressions of the senses. One calls such cognitions a priori and distinguishes them from empirical ones, which have their sources a posteriori, namely in experience. I've talked about this distinction before, and it is fundamental to Kant's philosophy, between the a priori and the a posteriori. And a couple of sessions ago, I mentioned that I think Kant is getting these terms either directly from Aristotle or indirectly through someone like Baumgarten, whose logical textbook Kant used for his students. I don't know whether Baumgarten uses this distinction or not, but it goes all the way back to Aristotle. And I read a passage from Aristotle where he talks about the different senses in which something might be prior. There is prior in time, but there's also other senses of being prior. And Kant is using the idea of prior as having to do with origin or cause. So we have some cognitions which are prior in the sense that they don't come from experience, even though in time they are connected to experience. And I also wanted to highlight the use of knowledge versus cognition. There have been some comments asking about what does it mean to speak of a priori knowledge? And cognition is a helpful word here because we're cognizant of the fact that there are these a priori factors in our experience. Let's call it experience. It's not quite knowledge. Knowledge seems like maybe too strong a word to use to refer to these a priori factors or cognitions. Okay, back to the text. The former expression is nevertheless not yet sufficiently determinate to designate the whole sense of the question before us. For it is customary to say of many a cognition derived from experiential sources that we are capable of it or partake in it a priori, because we do not derive it immediately from experience, but rather from a general rule. that we have nevertheless itself borrowed from experience. um, Received a question: what good use is all of this in the practical world? Well, I think that depends. I think you might ask, what good is the practical world absent real philosophical reflection, knowledge of oneself, knowledge of what's important, and why you are engaged in the various projects you find yourself engaged in. So it is common to ask questions like this about philosophy, but I do think it's worthwhile turning the question around and asking, why do so-called practical matters in the so-called real world not have the burden of proof, as opposed to reflection on things that orient what we're up to in the practical world as we choose to be engaged there. That's a very general answer. And I think I might just add that the proof is in the pudding. If you find it compelling to engage in philosophy, then awesome. And if you don't, then, carry on with other things that make more sense to you. But thank you for the question. So Kant is now going to distinguish different senses of the idea of being prior in order to help us understand what he means. So he says this. So one says of someone who undermined the foundation of his house that he could have known a priori that it would collapse. He could have known beforehand. That is, he need not have waited for the experience of it actually collapsing. Yet he could not have known this entirely a priori. For that bodies are heavy and hence fall if their support is taken away, must first have become known to him through experience. So this person had a general rule, which is that if you undermine the foundation of your house, it will fall. But that rule was based on things that were learned through experience. So he would have known that he knew that this would have happened a priori in advance, but not absolutely, because the general principle was still derived from experience. In the sequel, in what follows, therefore, we will understand by a priori cognitions, not those that occur independently of this or that experience, but rather those that occur absolutely independently of all experience. Opposed to them are empirical cognitions, or those that are possible only a posteriori, post-experience, if we want to put it that way, that is through experience. Among a priori cognitions, however, those are called pure, with which nothing empirical is intermixed. And if you think of the title of this work, Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is directing his attention in this work to reason separated out from all empirical factors, from anything which is derived from experience. Thus, for example, the proposition, every alteration has its cause, is an a priori proposition, only not pure, since alteration is a concept that can be drawn only from experience. Okay, I'm going to have a sip of coffee. Okay, section 2. Perhaps we'll do one more section and then take a look at David Hume. We are in possession of certain a priori cognitions, or knowledge, and even the common understanding is never without them. At issue here is a mark by means of which we can securely distinguish a pure cognition from an empirical one. Okay, how do we make this distinction? This is the question he's asking, between an a priori or pure cognition and one that is derived from experience. Experience teaches us, to be sure, that something is constituted thus and so, but not that it could not be otherwise. So from experience, we learn that something is in such and such a way. But we don't we don't know that it has to be that way. As far as we know, from what we learn from experience, it could be otherwise. First then, if a proposition is thought along with its necessity, it is an a priori judgment. If it is, moreover, also not derived from any proposition except one that in turn is valid as a necessary proposition, then it is absolutely a priori. Second, experience never gives its judgments true or strict, but only assumed and comparative universality through induction. So properly it must be said, as far as we have yet perceived, there is no exception to this or that rule. In other words, to this question of universality, we can't know for sure, to take a kind of standard example, that there are no black swans. All we know is that so far, all the swans we've seen are white. So we call that a universal rule, but really he's saying that type of rule derived from experience should be qualified like this. As far as we have perceived, as far as we know, there is no exception to this rule, but we don't know that it is strictly necessarily universal. It's worth writing this down. The a priori has two features. It is necessary, and it is universal. Whereas the a posteriori, what is derived from experience, has the opposite features. It is contingent. It could be otherwise, is what that means. And what's the opposite of universal? I guess we could say particular, or perhaps just non-universal. And I'll add one other thing, which is that how do we know whether something is necessary? One way is by finding out if you reject this necessary, this thing that might be necessary, does it lead to a contradiction? And if you find that it does, then you know that you've hit on a necessary principle. Now, off the top of my head, examples are escaping me. So perhaps I'll return to this at some point in more detail. It would be good to discuss that. So he continues, thus, if a judgment is thought in strict universality, that is, in such a way that no exception at all is allowed to be possible, then it is not derived from experience, but is rather valid absolutely a priori. So if there's no possible exception, things like 2 + 2 = 4, or that the sides of a square are equal to each other, or the Pythagorean theorem, if there's no possible exception, we're dealing with true universality and true necessity. But Kant is saying that type of universality and necessity can never be derived from experience. Experience may be the occasion, will be the occasion through which these necessary cognitions or judgments are realized, but they never arise out of experience as their sort of cause or source. Empirical universality is therefore only an arbitrary increase in validity from that which holds in most cases to that which holds in all, as in, for example, the proposition, all bodies are heavy. Whereas strict universality, so he's distinguishing between empirical and strict universality. Strict universality belongs to a judgment essentially. This points to a special source of cognition for it, namely a faculty of a priori cognition. Necessity and strict universality are therefore secure indications of an a priori cognition and also belong together inseparably. But since, in their use, it is sometimes easier to show the empirical limitations in judgments than the contingency in them, or is often more plausible to show the unrestricted universality that we ascribe to a judgment than its necessity, it is advisable to employ separately these two criteria, each of which is in itself infallible. So sometimes it's easier to recognize that an a priori cognition is necessary. Other times it's easier to recognize that it's universal. You can use either one, and either one tells you infallibly that you're dealing with something a priori, truly, absolutely a priori. Now, it is easy to show. I'll welcome this next comment. Please don't think I'm being dismissive of Kant or any Western philosopher. I really do think Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Confucius, and game theory offers a lot more practical use in the real world. Oh, I see. So you're suggesting that Kant is less practically useful. But you may be right. That's a fair question. I would encourage you to take some time with Kant and see what you think. And let me know what you find out. Now, it is easy to show that in human cognition, there actually are such necessary and in the strictest sense universal, thus pure a priori judgments. Before I continue, I'm thinking more about this question. So Aristotle, Stoicism, and Confucianism all predate Kant. But if you are interested in philosophy, as I said this at the beginning, whether it's Nietzsche or Heidegger or Foucault or the Frankfurt School of philosophers, sort of 20th century Marxists like Adorno or Deleuze, whether you're interested in Einstein or Freud or Carl Jung, all of them take for granted Kant's Copernican revolution. They're all working with some idea that there is a far more active component to the construction of cognition or knowledge than previous philosophy thought there was. So if you're just interested in Aristotle and Confucius, then maybe you don't need Kant. But if you're interested in anything that happened in the last 200 years of philosophy, you will understand it better if you have wrestled with Kant. That's just my take. But that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. Okay, I'm going to continue. Okay, so he thinks it's easy to show that in human cognition or human knowledge, there are such necessary and in the strictest sense universal, thus pure a priori judgments. And here he's got his sights on David Hume. He is directly responding in this work to Hume. He said that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. So David Hume was a turning point for Kant in his philosophical journey. But he thinks he needs to go beyond Hume because Hume lands in essentially a skeptical position. And Hume really rejects that there are necessary and in the strictest sense universal a priori judgments. Hume doesn't think we can get this, and we'll look at a text where he discusses this in a moment. And Kant wants to say Hume's critique was right of the standard way of thinking, of dogmatic rationalist philosophy, but his skepticism goes too far. So if one wants an example from the sciences, one need only look at all the propositions of mathematics. If one would have one from the commonest use of the understanding, the proposition that every alteration must have a cause will do. Indeed, in the latter, the very concept of a cause so obviously contains the concept of a necessity of connection with an effect and a strict universality of rule, that it would be entirely lost if one sought, as Hume did, to derive it from a frequent association of that which happens with that which precedes, and a habit, thus merely a subjective necessity of connecting representations arising from that association. Even without requiring such examples for the proof of the reality of pure a priori principles in our cognition, one could establish their indispensability for the possibility of experience itself, thus establish it a priori. All right, so just to review what he's just said. He's saying, okay, I'll start out by giving you a couple of examples of elements of experience, dimensions of experience that are strictly necessary and universal. So the first obvious example is math. These are things that we bring, the principles of mathematics are things that we bring to experience. They're not things that we drive out of experience. In terms of common sense, things that everyone takes for granted, if math doesn't do it for you, is cause and effect. He says, universally, he thinks we cannot help thinking that the relationship between cause and effect is strictly necessary and universal. And why is that? Because the very concept of a cause so obviously contains the concept of a necessity of connection with an effect. So there's a necessary conceptual relationship between the idea of a cause and the idea of an effect. Okay, so he's given us a couple of examples. He says, even without examples, we can also make a sort of argument for why there must be this universal necessary component to all experience. Why is that? For, he says, where would experience itself get its certainty if all rules in accordance with which it proceeds were themselves in turn always empirical and thus contingent? He's making here what he calls a transcendental argument, which proceeds in this fashion. It takes something for granted. He says, we have experience. It's just there. It is what it is. So given that we have experience, what has to be true in order for experience to be possible? Because we find that it's there. So Kant is not a radical skeptic in the sense that he doesn't question things all the way. He doesn't say, but do we have experience? He's not really interested in that question. He says, yes, we have it. It's there. What must be true given the things that are given to us? He's saying there have to be some rules of coherence for experience to even happen. And those can't come out of experience. They have to be prior to it because they have to be consistent. If the sort of frame within which experience was happening were always shifting, were always unstable, we couldn't even track from one experience to the next, from one moment to the next. So he's saying there has to be something permanent and fixed that we bring to experience, which allows it to be coherent and possible at all. Yet here we can content ourselves with having displayed the pure use of our cognitive faculty as a fact, together with its indication. Not merely in judgments, however, but even in concepts is an origin of some of them revealed a priori. Gradually remove from your experiential concept of a body everything that is empirical in it, the color, the hardness or softness, the weight, even the impenetrability. There still remains the space that was occupied by the body. Kant thinks that space is an a priori cognition. And you cannot leave that out. Likewise, if you remove from your empirical concept of every object, whether corporeal or incorporeal, bodily or not bodily, all those properties of which experience teaches you, you could still not take from it that by means of which you think it as a substance, or as dependent on a substance, even though this concept contains more determination than that of an object in general. Thus, convinced by the necessity with which this concept presses itself on you, you must concede that it has its seat in your faculty of cognition or your faculty of knowledge a priori. So space and time, Kant thinks, are a priori. They're things we bring to experience. They're the frame within which we construct our experience, in a sense, They're not things we derive out of experience. There's a fascinating article discussing the influence of this idea on Albert Einstein, who read this work by Kant at a young age. Also, the idea of substance. Kant thinks the idea that there is something there that subsists, that attributes attached to when we experience something. This, he thinks, also is necessary. It's something we bring to experience. Another comment. Yes, great figures of the world have admired Kant's work, but you know this and I know this, Kant is not accessible to most people because Kant's work is not practical enough, which can be used in the real world. Yeah, fair. I would say it's not just that they have admired Kant, but that Kant opened up new territory which they inhabit, which is a little bit different. Kant made ways of thinking possible that were not possible before. You're right that he's not very accessible, which is part of why I'm doing this series, because I think he is beneficial and can be made accessible. And then you say he's not practical enough, which is slightly different than whether he's accessible. And I would just say, what do you mean practical enough? Why is being practical a criterion of benefit, for one? And two, do you know that he's not practical enough? This work is certainly not practically oriented, but Kant thinks it has practical implications. He thinks it frees us from philosophical traps that influence the way we live. And he carries it forward into works that are directly practical in political philosophy, in moral philosophy, in anthropology. So that's what I have to say. Okay, section 3. Now's a good time to turn over to David Hume for a bit. This is an inquiry concerning human understanding. This was a later work. I'm not an expert in David Hume by any means, but from what I understand, this work was a sort of consolidation and restatement of arguments that he made earlier in his treatise on human nature. And that work, the treatise, was not translated into German, but this one was, and Kant had access to it. Yeah, the article, off the top of my head, I don't know the title, just responding to this comment. It's by Stephen Palmquist. So if that's what you're seeing, then that would be it. But I'm sure there might be other interesting ones on this topic as well. I'm going to go back just a bit. This discussion is kind of long. But let's start here. So of the idea of necessary connection. That's the topic of this chapter. I'm just going to hit a few highlights here. So David Hume says, there are no ideas which occur in metaphysics more obscure and uncertain than those of power, force, energy, or necessary connection, of which it is every moment necessary for us to treat in all our disquisitions. We shall therefore endeavor in this section to fix, if possible, the precise meaning of these terms, and thereby remove some part of that obscurity, so on and so forth. Power, force, energy, necessary connection. This is what Kant is talking about, cause and effect. Hume continues, to be fully acquainted, therefore, with the idea of power or necessary connection, let us examine its impression. In other words, what's our experience of it, of cause and effect? And in order to find the impression with greater certainty, let us search for it in all the sources from which it may possibly be derived. When we look about us towards external objects, things in the world, and consider the operation of causes, we are never able in a single instance to discover any power or necessary connection. So Kant would agree with this. He would say, yes, if you look out into the world, can you find, with strict absolute necessity and universality, this idea, this principle of cause and effect, that every effect has a cause, that every cause produces an effect? Kant and Hume would say, no, you can't. You cannot get it from experience. We cannot find any quality which binds the effect to the cause and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. We only find that the one does actually, in fact, follow the other. The impulse of one billiard ball is attended with motion in the second. This is the whole that appears to the outward senses. The mind feels no sentiment or inward impression from this succession of objects. Consequently, there is not, in any single particular instance of cause and effect, anything which can suggest the idea of power or necessary connection. So we observe that when you strike one billiard ball, it hits another, and the second one moves. But do we know from experience that this happens necessarily? Hume says no. All we know is that so far in our experience, this is what has happened. So then he looks at a couple of other cases. He says, since, therefore, external objects like billiard balls, as they appear to the senses, give us no idea of power or necessary connection by their operation in particular instances, let us see whether this idea be derived from reflection on the operations of our own minds. So can we go in our minds and find any experience of cause and effect, mental cause and effect, or volitional cause and effect? Again, he says no. I'm not going to read through all the arguments on this. But he concludes, after going through this, consequently, neither in the one case nor in the other are we ever conscious of any power. We learn the influence of our will from experience alone, volitional cause and effect. And experience only teaches us how one event constantly follows another, without instructing us in the secret connection which binds them together and renders them inseparable. Okay, he deals with some different ways of explaining this. Where I've gone further maybe than I wanted. Yeah, part 2. But to hasten to a conclusion of this argument, which is already drawn out to too great a length, we have sought in vain for an idea of power or necessary connection, what Kant calls cause and effect or alteration, in all the sources from which we could suppose it to be derived. It appears that in single instances of the operation of bodies, we never can, by our utmost scrutiny, discover anything but one event following another. All we know is that this happens, then that happens, without being able to comprehend any force or power by which the cause operates, or any connection between it and its supposed effect. So we call the first billiard ball that strikes the other, we call the first one a cause, and the motion of the second one we call an effect. But we don't perceive or experience or have any impression of what actually does that cause and effect relationship consist in. All we really have is that certain patterns occur, and we observe them across multiple instances. The same difficulty occurs in contemplating the operations of mind on body. So when I have a thought and I choose to move my arm, something like this, where we observe the motion of the latter to follow upon the volition of the former, but are not able to observe or conceive the tie which binds together the motion and volition, or the energy by which the mind produces this effect. The authority of the will over its own faculties and ideas is not a whit more comprehensible. So that upon the whole there appears not throughout all nature any one instance of connection which is conceivable by us. All events seem entirely loose and separate. This is the challenge that Kant is addressing. And Kant agrees with Hume. So much of what we just read in Hume is restated by Kant in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, where he says, necessary connections, necessary strict universality cannot be derived from experience. It is something that we bring to experience. It is the active sense in which we construct experience. And when we hear the word construct, we think of subjective. This is where I first went when I learned about Kant. Is that it's like the blind men and the elephant. If you've heard this parable, where one blind man feels the tail, the other feels the trunk, the other feels the body or the leg, and they all have different subjective experiences of the same underlying reality. Kant's not saying that. He's saying we, all human beings, unavoidably bring certain strictly necessary and universal judgments or cognitions to experience by which they construct their experience. But it's not a heuristic. It's not a sort of subjective form of experience. It's a strictly universal, necessary way that any rational creature, human or non-human, constructs experience. It's hard to understate how radical this idea is, how radical this Copernican revolution that Kant thinks he is initiating is in the history of philosophy. And I think it's only been a couple of hundred years, which in philosophical terms is not long. I think we're still wrestling with what it actually means, what the impact of this revolution is, and still evaluating whether Kant has given us something permanent or not. So it's interesting to think about this. I think this is a good point to wrap up. I've mentioned this in previous live streams, but I'm currently running a 6-week virtual philosophy intensive. It's called Cultivating an Intellectual Life. If you want to know more about things like this for the next one that I run, which I'll probably do a redo on this same one, which is really about to go to this question of practice, Stoicism, Aristotle. What does it mean to live a philosophical life on a practical level? That's what the intensive is about. To practice philosophy as a way of life, not just as engagement with abstract ideas. So I'll certainly rerun this one in the future. If you want to keep up to date on stuff like this, you can find me on Substack, Philosophy for Everyday Life, or Jimmy Herring. And yes, I will probably also run additional intensives on different themes and topics in philosophy. So yeah, if that's of interest, I'd love to connect with you on Substack. Of course, you can also email me. You should be able to access my email address in my YouTube bio. You have to click a couple times to get to it. But yeah, I think that's all for today. Thanks to those of you who are here, and thanks also for the questions. And I will look forward to seeing you next time.